Yeah, I have to read this from the iPad this time because the book is taking very long to get here. All right, part 1. The Jews of Wierzbnik. 1. The pre-war Jewish community of Wierzbnik, Staroswica. Wierzbnik, Staroswica is located in central Poland in the Kamienna River Valley, about 28 miles south of Radom and 95 miles south of Warsaw. Before World War I, Jews concentrated in the old town of Wierzbnik. Here, the Jewish population, which reached about 3,000 by 1939, pursued traditional occupations as cattle dealers, tailors, leather workers, shoemakers, upholsterers, hat makers, carpenters, butchers, bakers, blacksmiths, as well as small-scale merchants and shoekeepers. In typical Jewish families in Wierzbnik, mothers worked both in the family business and at home, often aided by a maid, and children attended public school in the morning and then received religious instruction in the afternoon. They lived in their own houses or apartments with electricity installed shortly before the war, but without running water or an indoor toilet. They spoke Yiddish at home and organized the rhythm of family life around the calendar of religious observances. For most survivors, pre-war Wierzbnik was remembered quite simply as a nice Jewish life, located in a region rich in lumber, as well as ore and clay deposits. The adjacent new town of Staroswica had the potential to grow into a small industrial city. Jews played an active role in the early stages of this development. In the late 19th century, the Rotwand family built a smelting furnace that was the beginning of the metallurgical industry in the area. Also, before the turn of the century, the 4 Liechtenstein brothers founded a plywood and veneer factory. After World War I, the government of newly independent Poland decided to make Staroswica the center of a government-owned armaments industry. It took over the smelting furnace in the lower part of the town and constructed a munitions factory in the upper town. Few Jews lived in this new town of Staroswica, and Jews were barred from employment in the armaments factories of Staroswica in the pre-war period. Many even avoided walking past them for fear of being accused of espionage. But another Jewish business with the international reach, owned by the Heller family, bought large tracts of forest land in the region and opened a lumber yard and a sawmill across the Kamienna River, just south of the town. The Liechtenstein and Heller firms were the major employers of Jewish workers in Wierzbnik. Subsequently, the sawmill and the lumber yard, the smelting furnace, and the munitions factory were destined to become the 3 central components using Jewish labor for the complex of Nazi slave labor camps, founded in 1942. World War I was traumatic for the Jews of Wierzbnik. The Tsarist regime doubted the loyalty of its Jews, and as the German army approached in 1915, the Jewish inhabitants of Wierzbnik were ordered to evacuate the town with less than 1 hour's notice. Russian troops exerted considerable force to drive the reluctant Jews north, first to Iza and then to Radom. There they spent 2 months living in utter destitution before the German army swept through central Poland. In effect, rescued from exile by the German army, the evacuated Jews of Wierzbnik were then allowed to return home, only to find half the town razed and the remaining homes totally pillaged. A typhus epidemic that swept through town only increased the hardship. Getting a good sense of Jewish life in interwar Wiersbennik from post-1945 testimonies is especially problematic for several reasons. First, neither the immediate post-war testimonies of 1945 to 48 nor the 1960s testimonies collected by German judicial investigators refer to the pre-war period. Second, the videotaped testimonies, especially those of the Visual History Archive of the USC Shoah Foundation Institute, taken in the late 1900s, do recall pre-war life, but most of those are given by survivors who are teenagers or in their early 20s in the camps, and thus either young children or teenagers in the 1930s. Given what they experienced immediately thereafter, their pre-war memories are understandably idealized and nostalgic. Survivors continually refer to their happy childhood. In the words of one survivor, everything was beautiful. According to the repeated assertions of another, everybody was happy. Only two testimonies even mention the economic hardships their parents experienced during the Great Depression, a theme that dominates the memories of non-Holocaust victims of that era. As mentioned in the introduction, distinct and diverging memory communities did not emerge among survivors who settled in Canada, the United States, and Israel in regard to war years. The pre-war years, on the other hand, represent an important exception to the generalization. Contrasting portrayals of the Jewish community in Wiersbennik in the 1930s are found in the testimonies of the North American survivors and the accounts, overwhelmingly of Israeli survivors, compiled for Wiersbennik Starashwitza, a memorial book, the Yizkor of Community Memorial Book, published in 1973. In the accounts of those who settled in North America, the Wiersbennik Jewish community enjoyed a vibrant religious and associational life, not untypical of pre-war provincial Poland. There was one major synagogue in the town, but also a number of prayer houses, or steibel, to suit individual inclinations. Most Wiersbennikers were Yiddish-speaking at home, and generally, if not fanatically observant by Orthodox traditionalists' standards. They were also followers of Ger Hasidism in Wiersbennik. The daughter of the Hasidic rabbi retrospectively characterized her family life as more religious than God would like. There was a network and a tradition of social support and charitable giving, with funds for poor children's schools fees, poor brides, a burial society, etc., and a Yiddish theater with visiting actors. Alongside this depiction of a generally traditional Jewish life, there was little discussion of modern political involvement. Just one testimony mentioned the presence of the Bund, the Jewish Secular Socialist Labor Party, in Wiersbennik. This was a town of craftsmen, shoe keepers, and workers in the Jewish-owned lumber firms, but not a Jewish factory proletariat, since Jews were not employed in the Starashwitza factories. Many survivors subsequently identified themselves rather vaguely as both religious and Zionist. But there is no reference to the ideological debates and hair-splitting amongst Zionist youth groups that characterize the memories of the urban Jewish intelligentsia. Insofar as Wiersbennikers who settled in North America specified in a particular kind of Zionism, they most often mentioned the right-wing, parliamentary, revisionist Zionists of Ziev Jabotinsky and its Batar youth group. Also in the nearby town of Byzantine, with its Jewish community of some 1,000, Beitar was the Zionist association that offered the greatest inspiration to the younger generation. As evidence of at least some secularization and modernization in Jewish life of less political kind, post-war testimony noted the existence of a Maccabi sports club, especially for soccer. According to the testimonies in this community book, however, Zionism was a dominant feature of Jewish life in Wierzbnik. Only one account described the Jewish community as a typical Polish Jewish town, in which the Jews filled their lives with religion and tradition. More typically, another described Wierzbnik as teeming with Zionist activity, and according to yet another version, Judaism and Zionism were, for Wierzbnikers, one and the same. In this narrative, the Zionist awakening began after World War I, associated with a new influx of Jews, especially the notable community activist Simcha Minkberg, who married the daughter of one of the four Liechtenstein brothers who owned the plywood and veneer factory. In the first generation, there was not yet a sharp break between traditional religious sensibilities and modern Zionism. Stemming from an extremely religious and traditional family, Minkberg wrote, "I made great efforts to ensure that the Zionist work would not be done contrary to religious outlooks. Indeed, the early Zionists created their own minyan, or prayer group, among the many such gatherings for religious observance in Wierzbnik." A second phase of Zionism followed that was decidedly more secular, political, and divided. Here, one encounters an array of rival Zionist associations, bewildering in its variety. On the right, there were both a religious Orthodox Zionist party, Mizrachi, and the militant and secular revisionist Zionists, followers of Jabotinsky, who devoted themselves to hiking, physical training, and pre-military drill. For revisionists, the appearance of Jabotinsky in nearby Ostroik was a memorable occasion. Middle-class Zionist Jews generally supported the mainstream Al-Ham Mishmar of Yitzhak Greenbaum, the longtime critic of assimilation, an Arabic defender of minority rights against the Polish government, in opposition to the religious non-Zionist Agudath Israel, dominant in the 1920s, which had supported the regime of Polish President Joseph Pilsudski in return for the communal autonomy in Jewish affairs. The moderate labor Zionists, Pauli Zion Right, sought to bridge class divides by organizing night classes and improving conditions for the working poor. The radical labor Zionists, Pauli Zion Left, became a decidedly leftist movement by Wierzbnik's standards, and two Wierzbnikers associated with it were hardcore communists who had to flee the country ahead of the Polish police to avoid arrest. Sports were not immune from the political and social fragmentation. The Maccabi Club was oriented to the middle and the right of the spectrum, while the Gviazdzi Club was founded to provide for the lower-class youth. However, in competition to recruiting the best players, the clubs sometimes jumped class lines. For some, Zionist youth activities were all-consuming. As Simcha Minkberg's daughter subsequently wrote, "Our childhood was wonderful, full of excitement. Everything and everywhere was part of a boiling cauldron of gatherings and meetings." Despite this bewildering array of associations, notably absent in Wierzbnik, though prominent elsewhere among Polish Jewry, were the secular non-Zionist social labor movement known as the Bund and the Marxist Zionist youth movement Hashomer Hatzair. As these were the two most prominent left-wing organizations in Jewish life in interwar Poland, their absence indicates that Wierzbnik was indeed more provincial and conservative than larger, more cosmopolitan Jewish urban communities. This difference in memories of Zionism and Wierzbnik between the North American and the Israeli survivor communities can probably be attributed to two factors. One is self-selection, as pre-war Zionist activities would have later immigrated from the displaced persons camp to Israel in greater proportions than the North America and vice versa for the non-Zionists. This tendency of self-selection would in turn have been reinforced by diverging collective memories. Once the survivors were in Israel, the contemporary environment would have strengthened their desire to remember and emphasize their past as active Zionists rather than as passive diaspora Jews, while the process of assimilation in North America would have diminished the tendency to remember and emphasize earlier Zionist identities. The emergence of a modern, Zionist-oriented element in Wierzbnik society was reflected in both education and politics. At the core of the modern trend was a more assimilated, economically better-off Jewish elite in Wierzbnik. These heads of family generally were businessmen and merchants, rather than shoekeepers and artisans. They tended to speak Polish rather than Yiddish at home. Some sought to send their children to private schools rather than to public schools in the morning, followed by traditional religious instruction, Heder, in the afternoon. As it became more difficult for Jews to get into elite private schools, they founded a Tarbut, modern Hebrew language, Zionist-oriented secular school in Wierzbnik as an alternative to the Heder. By one estimate, some 80% of Jewish pupils attended the Heder and 20% the Tarbut. The religious Zionists, in turn, founded their own Hebrew language, Hamizrachi school as well. In the early interwar period, the Jewish religious community, or Jemina, under the leadership of Smol Isser, pursued an apolitical course. This was in line with the governing style of Joseph Pilsudski, who safeguarded the autonomy of minorities in return for political quiescence. The craftsmen of Wierzbnik organized to protect their economic interests, but otherwise paid no heed to political issues and supported Isser. Their apolitical stance began to change in the 1930s as the younger, modern Zionist faction became more assertive. Simcha Minkberg founded a Jewish bank so that Jewish craftsmen and merchants would not be dependent on non-Jews for credit. And Minkberg, his colleague Joseph Drexler, and others began to run for and win positions on the town council, where the Jewish delegation, chaired by Minkberg, sought more actively to protect Jewish interests. When the young novice lawyer Uri Schremer arrived in Wierzbnik in 1937, he found the Jewish community divided between younger Zionists and older members of the religious, non-Zionist Agudath Israel, who kept out of public life and confined themselves to Jewish affairs. However, financial mismanagement by the governing board of the Jemina, in terms of failure to collect taxes and keep up Jewish institutions, led county government to dissolve the board and temporarily put Stremer in charge. With the support of the Zionists, he reorganized the tax system, restored the crumbling synagogue, and then arranged for new elections to be held to the board. The Zionists ran a united ticket and for the first time defeated the Isser-led traditional faction, which, in Stremer's partisan characterization, had turned their back on the people and passively accepted the edicts of the Polish authorities. There was one other area of divided memory concerning pre-war Wierzbnik, namely the factor of Polish anti-Semitism. A very distinct minority of survivors remembered Poles and Jews as getting along fairly well, with Wierzbnik not as bad as other places in Poland. Several noted explicitly that they experienced much more anti-Semitism during their army service than while living in Wierzbnik. According to Chuna Grinbaum's description of relations with Poles, we got along with them beautifully. We had no problem with them. Nobody bothered us. It was live and live and let live. The situation, he claimed, did not change until the war came. Then suddenly, Poles no longer acknowledged their former Jewish friends. Others dated a sharp change to just before the outbreak of war. Jeremiel Singer, his Israeli name in Poland, he was known as Rashmiel Zenger. In the account he wrote for the Wierzbnik Community Book, was even more adamant in exempting the Wierzbnik from the growing anti-Semitism fostered by Pilsudski's successors. He stated that the government's incitement against Jews hardly had any effect on Wierzbnik, despite the efforts of outsider anti-Semites to organize boycotts, strikes, and so on. These attempts failed entirely due to the disinterest of the Polish residents of Wierzbnik, who maintained their loyal relations with the Jewish population. Far more prevalent are bitter memories of a widespread anti-Semitism in Wierzbnik that escalated and intensified following the 1935 death of Pilsudski, whose relatively benign attitude towards minorities in Poland was supplanted by the militant and intolerant integral nationalism of his successors. As one survivor stated emphatically, and bitterly, "We had a beautiful life, except for having Poles around, which was very unpleasant." One prominent manifestation was the boycott movement, in which Poles either painted signs or stood in front of Jewish stores to deter customers from entering. The boycott was especially effective during Christmas shopping, according to one survivor. Several people noted, however, that since virtually all stores were owned by Jews, the Poles had nowhere else to shop, and the economic impact was thus mitigated. Jews cautiously conducted business from the back doors of their stores, when either being boycotted or illegally transacting business on Sundays. Others remembered the constant sight of hateful graffiti on the fences and sidewalks, and the shower of verbal abuse and rocks thrown by hooligans. Jewish boys had one gender-specific memory, namely the problem of fights and beatings at the hands of Polish boys, usually without any recourse to protection from teachers or police. Zai Feldpeiser remembered being beaten and kicked by Polish boys who got away with it because Zai was both a Jew and too weak to hit back. Abramik Nyman moved to Wierzbnik at the age of 9 from a place where Jews and Poles got along quite nice, and was surprised that he had to fight with Poles at his first school recess. Jewish boys in Wierzbnik learned what times and places were particularly dangerous. Boys had to be particularly careful to hide after class on Wednesdays, the day that the local priest visited the school, or risk being caught by their aroused Polish schoolmates in either being beaten or having pork sausage rubbed on their lips. They avoided swimming in the Kamiena River, for getting to the beach was a particularly dangerous gauntlet. Attending soccer games with their excited crowds was also a high risk best avoided. At least one young soccer enthusiast, who went to games anyways, nonetheless, left early to avoid a predictable post-game beating. However strong the consensus among the bulk of Wierzbnik's survivors concerning the breadth and nastiness of Polish anti-Semitism, there, particularly in the last 4 years before the war. Such memories should be placed in perspective. 2 other survivors of the Staroswice camps, who came from a town that experienced a murderous pogrom in 1936, offer pre-war memories that provide a sobering comparison. When 11-year-old Sarah and 14-year-old Lee Rosenblit came home from school in the small town of Pristik, 15 miles of Radom, west of Radom, on March 9, 1936, a neighbor warned them that Jews were being killed and they had best hide in their attic. When they were told it was okay to come out, their uncle lay dead in the hallway, his head having been severed with a hatchet, and their aunt died from her injuries 2 days later in a hospital in Radom. When their father, a cattle dealer, tried to recover cattle he had left with peasants for fattening, they refused and faced no repercussion. The Rosenblits fled town, having lost everything. When pressed by her persistent interviewer to talk about the happy times of her youth, Leigh replied bitterly that there had been no happy times. That was chapter 1, but honestly, I don't feel like these are long enough, so we're going to go ahead and do chapter 2 also. If you guys are down with that, why not? It's only, 9:35? Yeah, we'll do another chapter. Long as, if I get no happy times. Exactly. Chapter 2, The Outbreak of War. The outbreak of war on September 1, 1939, posed a double threat to Wierzbnic's Jews. As inhabitants of a town in close proximity to the munitions and steel factories of Staroswice, they feared bombing. As Jews, they feared the Germans. The result was widespread panic and flight. Though, as Meir Janissar put it, he was unsure whether his family fled as Poles or as Jews. In fact, several patterns of flight emerged. Some, indeed, tried to escape the Germans by reaching Soviet-occupied territory, which before the Soviet entry into eastern Poland on September 17 was much farther east than the subsequent demarcation line. Very few who attempted this trip actually made it, and among the few who did, some even subsequently changed their minds and returned. But most Wierzbnickers primarily feared the bombing. They fled to villages where they had friends or relatives, or even nearby forests, and returned home as soon as the German army swept past, leaving Wierzbnik Staroswice occupied but no longer a potential military target. And a few Jews intentionally came to Wierzbnik from elsewhere, because in comparison to their hometowns, it seemed the safer refuge. 1 week before the outbreak of war, the district inspector of police visited the main synagogue in Wierzbnik and asked for volunteers to dig defense trenches. Jews and Poles, he stressed, were now in the same boat. Many Jews volunteered and worked even on the Sabbath. With the outbreak of war, the Germans did not, in fact, try to destroy the Staroswice factories, which they hoped to capture intact. Nonetheless, the many planes flying overhead caused great fear, and stray bombs landed in the vicinity of Wierzbnik on each of the first 2 days of hostilities. This set in motion a widespread flight from the town, and by September 5, the mayor dismissed those who had stayed behind to dig trenches and advised them to leave as well. In most of the testimonies of survivors who briefly fled Wierzbnik, this episode is related quite simply. Their families packed their possessions in horse-drawn wagons, and they made their way on crowded roads to not too distant villages where they had relatives or friends. After the Germans had arrived in both Wiersbennik, Staroswica, and their places of refuge, they had nowhere else to go, and it made no sense to stay any longer. Within a week or two, they returned to their homes in Wiersbennik from what one survivor labeled a useless exercise. Some returned home to find that none of their possessions had been touched. The rabbi's family in particular was surprised to discover that a Polish woman they deemed an anti-Semite had protected their home from robbers. More often, returning Jews found that their stores or homes had been looted, or the family chickens taken. One young woman returned to find her father and brother-in-law hiding and the family grocery store being pillaged. As young Polish anti-Semites stood in front of the signaled passing Germans that there was still something worth looting inside. In the case of Wauchope, just 3 miles up the river from Wiersbennik, those returning found most of the town had been razed in the retaliation for a roof-stop sniper attack on German troops. In Bodzentine, 15 miles south of Wiersbennik, the town's most prominent and wealthiest family, the Zachters, weighed the respective insecurities of remaining in town or trying to reach Soviet territory. After several days of hesitation, they opted for the latter. With 2 wagons, one loaded with possessions and the other with family members, they headed first for the estate of a wealthy Polish landowner, with whom Mr. Zachter, a grain merchant and flour mill owner, had maintained good business and personal relations. They were received cordially the first evening, but by the next day, it was clear that they were no longer welcome, as the presence of a Jewish family on the estate was causing great unease. They headed back towards Wiersbennik and stayed a few days in a small village in the home of a wealthy Jewish grain merchant while they reconsidered their options. They decided once again to head east on the crowded roads. When they became entangled with retreating units of Polish soldiers who threatened to confiscate their horses, they turned off the main road and headed toward home on dirt tracks. After waiting a few additional days in a summer cottage they often visited deep in the forest, they finally returned to Bodzentine, amazed to find everything exactly the way we had left it, even including American dollar bills left behind in the haste of departure. Even before the outbreak of war, and out of fear of bombing, the Glatt family, father, mother, son, daughter-in-law, and 3 daughters, had already hired a horse and buggy for flight to the hometown of the father's parents. Within 10 days, the German army had occupied the entire area. Father and son then traveled to the city of Ostrowik to consult other family members. There they were challenged by a German soldier. The father halted, but the son started to run and was immediately shot dead. He was the first Jew from Wiersbennik to be killed by the Germans. Ironically, while Wiersbennik Jews fled their town at the outbreak of war out of fear that the nearby factories would be bombed, once that fear proved unfounded, it very quickly became a town that Jews fled to, not from. In the city of Tarnobreg, in the city of Tarnobreg, 3,400 Jews were rounded up by Germans, put on rafts for transport over the San River, and told to go to Russia. Once they were no longer under guard, one family opted to go west rather than east and made their way on foot to the home of a sister in Wiersbennik. As one daughter explained, at that point, they did not know what would happen and subsequently it was too late to change their fateful decision. A family that owned a lumber yard in Skaroswiko, Kamiena, fled that city at the outbreak of war and stayed away for 2 or 3 weeks, knowing that they would be unable to hide lumber products. They decided to abandon the business. They returned to Skarinsko, Kamiena, only to pick up personal possessions and join the maternal grandparents in Wierzbnik. 14-year-old Henryk Krystal from Sosnowiec was visiting his maternal grandparents in Bodzentine, where the war broke out, but his mother took him back to Sosnowiec as soon as it was possible to travel. Faced with labor roundups, Henryk's brother and then his father headed east and made their way to Soviet territory. On the presumption that younger boys were less endangered, Henryk was not allowed to undertake such a risky and arduous flight, but instead was sent back to Bodzentine with many of the family's possessions, to be rejoined by his mother later. In Lodz, the family of Guta Blas owned a textile factory that made uniforms for the army. In December 1939, before the ghetto was formed, and before his factory had been seized, her father nonetheless sensed it was getting too dangerous to remain in Lodz, and decided to move to Wierzbnik, the hometown of his wife's family. They placed what belongings they could, especially a sewing machine, in one wagon. The father spoke fluent German, so they traveled as a family of mixed descent, not as Jews, and reached Wierzbnik despite heavy snow. Another Lodzer, a salesman, made the same calculation in December 1939, with that this city was becoming too dangerous, and moved with his wife and 3 children to Wierzbnik because he had business contacts there. While some outsiders came to Wierzbnik for presumed greater safety, some Wierzbnikers decided to make an attempt to flee to the Soviet zone once the partition of Poland, as prearranged in the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, had been completed. Following the invasion of the Soviet army from the east on September 17, the closest crossing points of the new demarcation line were at Przemysl on the San River, 140 miles away, and Hrubiesau on the Bug River, 160 miles away. One group of about 20, including the prominent Drexler family, must have taken the latter route, having crossed the Vistula River by barge to avoid German sentries on the bridge there. They crossed over the Bug into the Soviet zone without being stopped and reached Luck. When asked by Soviet authorities to fill out a questionnaire as to where they ultimately intended to settle, they naively wrote Palestine instead of the Soviet Union. That landed them in a forest work camp near Archangel. Pinchas Nudelman was among a group of young Jews from Wierzbnik who took the train to Przemysl, where they paid a smuggler to get them across the river. The smuggler turned them over to German patrol that robbed them before allowing them to proceed. Reaching Lwów, Pinchas was arrested and sent to a village of exiled Uzbeks near Archangel. They were not the only Wierzbnikers to end up felling trees near Archangel. Moshe Samet made one attempt to reach the border, but was caught by a German patrol and interned in a POW camp because he had helped himself to abandoned Polish army clothing. After escaping from the camp, he returned to Wierzbnik and joined Yitzhak Kerbel in another attempt to reach the Soviet zone. Dumped by their Polish boatmen in the middle of the San River, they reached the Soviet, sides soaking wet, and made their way to Lwów. From there they moved deeper into the Soviet Union, worked as coal miners in the Donbass, and eventually joined the Polish army that was being raised on Soviet territory. Joining the Polish army in the Soviet Union was also the path to survival of at least one other Wierzbeniker. In addition to working in the Arctic or serving in military, some who reached the Soviet zone opted for a third alternative, namely to return to their homes in the German zone. Abraham Rosenwald was among a group of young men who reached the Soviet zone near Przemysl, but only after being robbed first by Germans and then by the Poles they had paid to smuggle them over the river. Finding himself with no food or warm winter clothing, he could not endure and decided to return. Several people from towns near Wierzbnik, Staroswica, such as Opatał, Szydłowiec, and Bodzentine, who had made good their escape, also made the same decision. Three brothers fled Opatał 5 days after the outbreak of the war and successfully made their way to Ukraine via roads filled with refugees and clogged with abandoned cars. Finding conditions there difficult and fearing that they, like many other refugees from Poland, would be sent deep into the interior to work in the coal mines, they hired a guide to take them back over the Bug River and reached home in January 1940. Another young man from Opatał, having been seized, briefly held as a male of military age and then released, joined a group that made its way under fire across the Bug River. Learning that his father had been told that he had been shot and killed during the crossing, he made what he thought was a temporary return trip to Opatał to reassure his family. He never made it back to the Soviet territory. From Szydłowiec, one survivor's brother, among others, made good his escape to the Soviet zone, but he found life there very hard, and since he had left behind a baby daughter, he returned. 3 of Goldie Sochter's uncles, 2 from Bodzentine, and 1 from the disintegrated Polish army, made good their escape to the Soviet zone and fortuitously met up in a breadline. After months on the Soviet side, they returned to Bodzentine in the early spring of 1940. The entire family treated their return as a joyous event. David Mongarten's brother and brother-in-law also made it to Soviet territory, returned to Wierzbnik to tell others that it was not so bad there, but then found themselves unable to cross back over the border again. In the memories of many Staroswica survivors, the first day of the war were a crazy time of great uncertainty and panicked flight. For most, the immediate concern was to avoid the destruction of war, which, in Wierzbnik, was above all perceived as the threat of aerial bombing. But even for those who thought about escape eastward beyond the German reach, the speed of the German advance passing through Staroswica on November 8 quickly rendered such plans hopeless for most. Thereafter, they began to trickle back to their homes to face not a short-term military threat, but a long-term encounter with Nazi occupation policies. That is the end of Chapter 2.